January 17, 1991. 02:30 hours local time. Baghdad, Iraq. Across the country, Iraqi air defense radar operators sat at their stations, monitoring the night sky. The coalition air campaign, expected for weeks, could commence at any moment. When it came, they would be ready. The integrated air defense network that protected Iraq had been refined over 8 years of war with Iran. Soviet advisors had helped design the system. Thousands of surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft guns covered the country. Fighter aircraft stood alert at air bases throughout Iraq, ready to intercept coalition strikes. At precisely 02:38 hours, the radars lit up. Multiple contacts appeared on screens across the country. Air defense operators began tracking the incoming aircraft, attempting to count the targets, calculate intercept solutions, prepare engagement orders. But the contacts kept multiplying. 5 aircraft became 10, 10 became 20, 20 became 50. The numbers exceeded normal raid sizes. Controllers increased scale on their displays, attempting to comprehend the scope of the incoming formation. The count continued rising. 100 aircraft, 200, 300. The radar operators struggled to process what they were seeing. This wasn't a normal strike package. This was something unprecedented in their experience. Aircraft were approaching from multiple directions simultaneously. Some came from Saudi Arabia to the south. Others approached from carriers in the Persian Gulf. More came from bases in Turkey and from Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, via circuitous routes designed to hit targets from unexpected vectors. Baghdad's sky filled with aircraft of types and nations Iraqi defenders had never seen operate together. F-117. Nighthawks conducted the initial strikes against command and control centers, their stealth characteristics making them invisible to radar until their precision-guided weapons were already impacting targets. F-15E Strike Eagles followed, carrying loads of precision munitions against high-value targets. F-16 Fighting Falcons swept through Iraqi airspace, engaging air defense systems and interdicting Iraqi forces. F-A-18 Hornets from carrier air wings struck coastal targets and penetrated deep into Iraqi territory. A-6 Intruders, the Navy's all-weather attack aircraft, pressed attacks despite darkness and adverse conditions. B-52 Stratofortresses conducted arc-light strikes, carpet coverage of Iraqi Republican Guard positions with conventional ordnance. British Tornado GR-1 struck Iraqi airfields and infrastructure. French Mirage 2000s provided both air defense and strike capability. Saudi F-15s patrolled their own airspace while preparing for offensive operations. Wave after wave continued through the night. When the first strike package departed, another was already inbound. The attacks were continuous, coordinated through airborne command posts, managing hundreds of aircraft simultaneously. Iraqi Air Defense headquarters received reports from command centers across the country. The messages were consistent and increasingly desperate. Coalition aircraft were everywhere simultaneously. Strikes were occurring in Baghdad, Basra, Mosul, Kirkuk, along the Kuwaiti border, at airfields throughout the country, at command centers, at communications facilities, at strategic targets that Iraqi planners thought they had protected adequately. The Iraqi Air Force commander, Lieutenant General Hamid Sha'aban, attempted to organize a response. He ordered fighters to scramble from multiple bases, directing them to intercept the coalition strikes. The Iraqi pilots took off into chaos. For every Iraqi aircraft that managed to get airborne, 10 coalition aircraft were already operating in Iraqi airspace. The Iraqi fighters found themselves outnumbered, outmatched technologically, and operating without the coordinated ground control they depended on because coalition strikes had already disrupted the command and control network. Within the first 3 hours of Operation Desert Storm, 39 Iraqi aircraft attempted to engage coalition forces. 38 were engaged by coalition fighters and eliminated. 1 escaped. Iraqi pilots who survived these encounters returned to their bases shaken, reporting to commanders that the situation was hopeless. They were overwhelmed. The numerical advantage coalition forces possessed was insurmountable. The technology gap was even worse. Coalition fighters engaged Iraqi aircraft from beyond visual range with missiles Iraqi pilots couldn't counter. The encounters weren't battles, they were executions. By dawn on January 17th, the Iraqi Air Force was beginning a strategic retreat that would never reverse. More than 700 coalition aircraft had struck Iraq in a single night, the largest opening air offensive in modern military history. And this was just the beginning. Iraqi intelligence analysts, reviewing the overnight reports, reached a horrifying conclusion. The coalition hadn't committed its full strength on the first night. They had reserves, many reserves. The force they would face over the coming weeks would be even larger than the overwhelming capability demonstrated in the opening hours. An Iraqi Air Force officer captured weeks later described the reaction in his command center. "We prepared for war with Iran. We had fought them for 8 years. We understood that conflict. America brought a force we cannot comprehend. The numbers were impossible. The technology was from the future. We knew within hours that we had lost the air war before it truly began." To understand the shock Iraqi forces experienced, you need to understand their assessment of the threat they faced and the confidence they placed in their own capabilities. The Iraqi Air Force on the eve of Desert Storm was substantial by regional standards, numbering more than 750 combat aircraft. The inventory reflected years of arms purchases from the Soviet Union and France. Approximately 300 MiG fighters of various models operated in Iraqi squadrons. The MiG-21, the Soviet Union's most widely exported fighter, formed the backbone with approximately 150 aircraft. These were reliable, rugged fighters that Iraqi pilots knew well from years of operations against Iran. The MiG-23, a more advanced variable geometry wing fighter, added another 70 aircraft with improved performance and weapons systems. The MiG-25, the high-speed, high-altitude interceptor NATO called Foxbat, provided approximately 30 aircraft for defense against high-flying threats. The MiG-29, the Soviet Union's most modern fighter at that time, had been delivered in limited numbers, perhaps 40 aircraft, representing the Iraqi Air Force's most capable air superiority platform. French-supplied Mirage F-1 fighters numbered approximately 150, split between air defense variants and ground attack versions. The Mirage F-1 was an excellent aircraft, proven in multiple conflicts, highly regarded by pilots who flew it. Iraqi pilots had extensive experience operating Mirages during the Iran-Iraq War and considered them equal or superior to most aircraft they might face. Soviet-designed Su-7, Su-20, Su-22, and Su-25 attack aircraft provided ground attack capability, numbering approximately 100 aircraft total. These were dedicated strike platforms, some dating to the 1960s, but still effective for close air support and battlefield interdiction when properly employed. Long-range strike capability came from Tu-16 and Tu-22 bombers, approximately 70 aircraft. These were elderly designs by 1991 standards, but they provided Iraq with the ability to strike distant targets with heavy bomb loads, a capability few regional powers possessed. The Iraqi Air Force carried substantial combat experience from the Iran-Iraq War that lasted from 1980 to 1988. 8 years of intensive air combat operations had provided Iraqi pilots with experience levels that pilots of many other air forces lacked. They had flown combat missions regularly. They had engaged enemy fighters. They had conducted strike missions against defended targets. They had operated under combat conditions where mistakes meant death. This experience, Iraqi commanders believed, had hardened their force and provided training that peacetime air forces couldn't replicate. Iraqi air combat doctrine followed Soviet models, emphasizing centralized ground-controlled intercept operations. Ground control intercept centers tracked both friendly and hostile aircraft, vectoring Iraqi fighters toward threats, providing tactical guidance during engagements, and coordinating multiple aircraft in defensive operations. Iraqi pilots were trained to follow GCI directions rather than operate independently. The system worked well when communications remained intact and controllers had accurate situational awareness. Iraqi air defense integrated fighters with one of the world's most extensive surface-to-air missile networks. Soviet-supplied SA-2, SA-3, SA-6, and SA-8 missile systems provided overlapping coverage across Iraqi territory. More than 3,000 anti-aircraft artillery pieces filled the gaps in missile coverage, creating a layered defense that had proven effective against Iranian attacks during the war. Radar sites throughout the country fed data to command centers that coordinated the entire network. Iraqi planners considered their air defense impenetrable by any force that lacked overwhelming technological advantages. Iraqi intelligence had assessed coalition capabilities during the months of build-up following Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990. The analysis, based on historical American deployments and Soviet intelligence sharing, concluded that the United States would deploy approximately 500 to 700 combat aircraft for operations against Iraq. This estimate drew from Vietnam War-era deployment patterns, where the United States had deployed substantial but manageable forces. 500 to 700 aircraft represented a significant threat, but one Iraq could contest with Soviet-supplied SAM systems providing coverage and Iraqi fighters engaging when opportunities presented themselves. Saddam Hussein's public statements throughout late 1990 and early January 1991 reflected confidence that Iraq could withstand coalition military action. He spoke of the mother of all battles, awaiting coalition forces. He suggested that American and coalition casualties would be so high that Western democracies would lack the will to sustain operations. He pointed to Iraq's experience during the Iran-Iraq War as evidence of Iraqi military capability and resilience. These weren't just propaganda statements. They reflected genuine assessment by Iraqi leadership that the military balance, while unfavorable, wasn't insurmountably so. Iraqi military planners expected that air defense systems would engage a substantial percentage of attacking aircraft. Surface-to-air missiles would force coalition aircraft to fly low, where anti-aircraft artillery would engage them. The combination would inflict losses that would constrain coalition air operations and provide Iraqi fighters with opportunities to operate effectively. The losses wouldn't stop coalition operations, but they would make the air campaign expensive enough to limit its scope and duration. Training assessments by Iraqi Air Force leadership concluded that their pilots were equivalent to American and coalition pilots. The combat experience Iraqi pilots had accumulated during the Iran-Iraq War, they reasoned, provided advantages that peacetime training couldn't match. Iraqi pilots had engaged enemy fighters in actual combat. They had conducted strike missions against defended targets, where surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft fire were real threats rather than training simulations. This experience, Iraqi commanders believed, would prove decisive when combat commenced. The numerical balance seemed manageable based on Iraqi intelligence estimates. 750 Iraqi aircraft versus an expected 700 coalition aircraft represented rough parity. With Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles providing support, Iraqi forces could contest air superiority and make coalition air operations costly enough to affect strategic calculations. Timeline assessments by Iraqi intelligence suggested that coalition force buildup would require many additional months beyond January 1991. Moving the necessary forces, equipment, and supplies to the Persian Gulf region to support major military operations against Iraq would take longer than the approximately 5 months between Kuwait's invasion and January. This assessment suggested Iraq had time to prepare positions, refine tactics, and possibly achieve diplomatic solutions that would avoid war entirely. The assessment was wrong. Coalition forces were ready to commence operations in mid-January, having compressed the build-up timeline through logistical efforts that exceeded what Iraqi planners thought possible. Soviet support, or at least Soviet diplomatic assistance, was expected by Iraqi leadership. The Soviet Union had been Iraq's primary arms supplier for decades. Soviet advisors had helped design Iraqi air defenses. Soviet instructors had trained Iraqi pilots and air defense personnel. Diplomatic relationships between Moscow and Baghdad had been close throughout the Cold War period. Iraqi planners assumed the Soviet Union would provide intelligence support and diplomatic cover for Iraqi operations. But by late 1990, Soviet policy under Mikhail Gorbachev had shifted dramatically. The Soviet Union did not oppose UN Security Council resolutions authorizing force against Iraq. They provided no intelligence support. they offered no diplomatic protection. Iraqi expectations of Soviet assistance proved completely unfounded, leaving Iraq more isolated than Iraqi planners had anticipated. All of these assessments, these confidence factors, these intelligence estimates that shaped Iraqi military planning throughout late 1990 and early 1991 shared one common characteristic. They were catastrophically wrong. What Iraqi forces would actually face bore no resemblance to what they had prepared for. The coalition that assembled to liberate Kuwait and enforce UN Security Council resolutions represented the largest multinational air power concentration since World War II, and it was orders of magnitude more capable than Iraqi assessments suggested. Operation Desert Shield, the defensive phase that preceded offensive operations, commenced in August 1990, immediately following Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. The deployment that followed represented the most rapid and extensive projection of air power in military history. Aircraft flew from bases in the United States, Europe, and throughout the Pacific to staging areas in Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Turkey, Diego Garcia, and aboard aircraft carriers positioning in the Persian Gulf and Red Sea. The United States Air Force deployed more than 1,300 combat aircraft, the largest concentration of American air power since Vietnam. F-15C Eagles, the premier air superiority fighter in the world in 1991, deployed in substantial numbers with the primary mission of establishing and maintaining air supremacy. The F-15's combat record was unblemished. Not a single F-15 had ever been lost in air-to-air combat across multiple conflicts and numerous engagements. Iraqi pilots would learn why that record existed. F-15E Strike Eagles, a two-seat variant optimized for deep strike missions, brought the ability to conduct precision strikes at night and in adverse weather. The aircraft combined the F-15's airframe performance with advanced targeting systems and substantial weapons payload, creating a platform capable of engaging the most heavily defended targets Iraq possessed. F-16C Fighting Falcons deployed in greater numbers than any other type. Several hundred aircraft providing multi-role capability for air superiority, strike, and close air support missions. The F-16 was agile, proven, and capable of employing the full range of precision-guided and conventional weapons in the American inventory. F-117 Nighthawks, the stealth attack aircraft that had been operational since the early 1980s, but remained largely unknown to the public, deployed to Saudi Arabia in complete secrecy. The 42 F-117s in theater represented a capability Iraqi defenses had never encountered and couldn't counter. Their ability to penetrate defended airspace undetected and deliver precision weapons on high-value targets would prove decisive in the opening phase of the air campaign. A-10 Thunderbolt IIs, affectionately known as Warthogs, deployed for the mission they were designed to perform since the 1970s, engaging armored vehicles and providing close air support to ground forces in high-threat environments. The A-10's titanium bathtub protecting the cockpit, redundant systems, and devastating GAU-8 Avenger 30mm cannon made it uniquely suited for operations against Iraqi armor. F-111 Aardvarks brought low-level precision strike capability, particularly effective at night, when their terrain-following radar enabled operations that other aircraft couldn't attempt. B-52 Stratofortresses, deploying from Diego Garcia and continental United States bases, provided conventional heavy striking power. Each B-52 could carry 51 500-pound bombs internally, plus additional weapons on wing pylons, delivering carpet coverage of area targets. Supporting this combat force were approximately 300 tanker aircraft, KC-135 Strato tankers and KC-10 extenders, enabling the enormous sortie rates that coalition forces would maintain throughout the campaign. Without aerial refueling, the air campaign as executed would have been impossible. Tankers' extended range increased payload capacity by enabling takeoff at heavier weights, with the knowledge that fuel could be replenished en route, and provided flexibility in mission planning that transformed air operations. E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft, more than 40 deploying to the theatre, provided airborne command and control tracking, both coalition and Iraqi aircraft, coordinating strike packages, directing fighter intercepts and managing the extraordinarily complex airspace that hundreds of simultaneous sorties created. The AWACS was the orchestra conductor enabling the symphony of coalition air power to function without collisions, fratricide, or chaos. Electronic warfare aircraft, primarily EA-6B Prowlers and EF-111 Ravens, provided jamming capability that disrupted Iraqi radar and communications, creating windows of opportunity for strike aircraft to penetrate defenses. Reconnaissance aircraft, including U-2s, RF-4Cs, and an array of sensors on various platforms, provided intelligence essential for targeting and bomb damage assessment. Transport aircraft, more than 100 C-130s, C-1441s, and C-5s, sustained the deployed force with the continuous flow of spare parts, ordnance, supplies, and personnel replacements that modern air operations consumed in enormous quantities. The United States Navy deployed 6 aircraft carrier battle groups to the region, an unprecedented concentration of carrier air power. Collectively, the carrier air wings embarked on USS Saratoga, USS John F. Kennedy, USS Saratoga, USS Midway, USS Ranger, and USS Theodore Roosevelt, provided more than 550 combat aircraft. F-14 Tomcats provided fleet air defense and strike capability. The F-14's AN/AWG-9 radar could track multiple targets simultaneously at ranges exceeding 100 miles, and the AIM-54 Phoenix missiles could engage threats from beyond visual range with probability of intercept that made them extraordinarily effective. FA-18 Hornets formed the backbone of carrier air wings, multi-role fighters equally capable in air-to-air and air-to-ground missions. The Hornets' reliability, ease of maintenance, and combat versatility made it ideal for sustained carrier operations. A-6 Intruders, the Navy's all-weather attack aircraft, brought sophisticated navigation and targeting systems, enabling precision strike in conditions where other aircraft couldn't operate effectively. The A-6 had proven itself in Vietnam and continued to provide capabilities unmatched by newer platforms. EA-6B Prowlers operated from carriers and land bases, providing the electronic warfare capability essential for suppressing enemy air defenses. E-2C Hawkeyes, the carrier-based airborne early warning aircraft, provided radar coverage and command and control, essentially functioning as mini AWACS for carrier battle groups. United States Marine Corps Aviation deployed more than 140 aircraft, primarily FA-18 Hornets and AV-8B Harrier jump jets. Marine aviation operated from both land bases and amphibious assault ships, providing close air support capability organic to ground forces. Coalition forces beyond the United States contributed substantially to the air armada assembling in the Persian Gulf region. The United Kingdom's Royal Air Force deployed more than 90 Tornado aircraft, split between GR-1 attack variants and F-3 air defense fighters. British Tornadoes would conduct some of the most dangerous missions of the campaign, striking Iraqi airfields at low altitude to crater runways and disable operations. Saudi Arabia provided more than 300 combat aircraft, including F-15S Eagles, Tornadoes purchased from Britain, and F-5 Tigers. Saudi aircraft and pilots would play significant roles throughout the campaign, operating over their own territory and conducting strike missions into Iraq and occupied Kuwait. France deployed approximately 60 combat aircraft, primarily Mirage 2000s and Jaguar attack aircraft. French pilots brought extensive combat experience from operations in Africa and would prove highly effective in coalition operations. Kuwait, though its territory was under Iraqi occupation, had evacuated approximately 40 A-4 Skyhawks and Mirage F-1 fighters before the Iraqi invasion was complete. Kuwaiti pilots, flying from Saudi bases, participated in combat operations to liberate their nation. Canada deployed 24 CF-18 Hornets, essentially Canadian-built FA-18s. Italian Tornadoes, Bahraini F-16s, Qatari Mirage fighters, and United Arab Emirates aircraft added to the coalition total. Even nations with modest air forces contributed to the effort, creating a truly multinational force unprecedented in modern military operations. The logistics infrastructure supporting this air armada was as impressive as the combat aircraft themselves. More than 30 airfields throughout Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and other coalition nations hosted combat operations. Forward operating bases closer to the Kuwaiti border enabled faster response times and higher sortie rates. Pre-positioned ordnance stockpiles ensured sufficient weapons for sustained operations. Fuel supply networks, including pipelines and road transport, delivered millions of gallons of jet fuel daily. The command structure unified these diverse forces under coherent operational control. The Air Tasking Order, a massive document produced daily, coordinated every coalition sortie, specified targets, allocated aircraft, assigned tanker support, deconflicted flight paths, and prevented fratricide. Producing and distributing the ATO was a technological and organizational marvel, enabling thousands of sorties to execute in the same airspace without chaos. Training during the months of Desert Shield refined coalition tactics and procedures. Aircraft from different nations, with different radios, different procedures, and different tactical doctrines, learned to operate together. Exercises practiced air refueling between different tanker and receiver combinations. Strike coordination with multiple nations' aircraft in the same package, and communication protocols that ensured clear understanding despite language differences. Intelligence preparation during Desert Shield identified every significant military target Iraq possessed. Air defense sites, command centers, communications facilities, airfields, hardened aircraft shelters, bunkers, bridges, power stations, and military installations were catalogued, analyzed, and prioritized. Reconnaissance satellites and aircraft photographed Iraq repeatedly, creating comprehensive target intelligence that would enable the precision with which the air campaign executed. The Iraqi failure to recognize the scale of coalition buildup was extraordinary in retrospect. Iraqi reconnaissance aircraft and agents certainly photographed and reported on the massive deployment occurring throughout the Gulf region from August through December 1990. But Iraqi intelligence analysts consistently underestimated the total force assembling. They appeared unable to accept that the coalition could deploy and sustain forces of the magnitude actually arriving. When the estimates suggested more than 1,500 aircraft were present by December, intelligence officers adjusted the numbers downward to match expectations rather than accepting the observations. By the time Operation Desert Storm commenced, Iraqi intelligence estimated coalition strength at approximately 1,100 to 1,300 aircraft total. The actual number was 2,790 aircraft, an underestimate of more than 1,000 aircraft or 60% of the actual force. The numerical advantage this created was overwhelming. 2,790 coalition aircraft versus 750 Iraqi aircraft represented a superiority ratio of 3.7 to 1. But the numerical advantage only told part of the story. The technological gap compounded the numerical superiority to create imbalance unprecedented in modern warfare. Coalition aircraft employed beyond visual range missiles, specifically the AIM-7 Sparrow, AIM-120 AMRAAM, and AIM-54 Phoenix, that could engage Iraqi aircraft before Iraqi pilots could even see coalition fighters. Iraqi aircraft, primarily equipped with older Soviet missiles optimized for close-range combat, couldn't respond to BVR engagements effectively. The result was that Iraqi fighters died before they could engage, their weapons useless because the range was beyond their capability. Precision-guided munitions, particularly laser-guided bombs and early GPS-guided weapons, enabled coalition aircraft to hit specific aim points with accuracy previously impossible. Iraqi forces relied almost entirely on unguided ordnance, requiring mass delivery to achieve desired effects. A single coalition aircraft with precision weapons could accomplish what would require dozens of Iraqi aircraft delivering unguided bombs. Stealth technology, embodied in the F-117 Nighthawk, provided capability to penetrate defended airspace without detection. Iraqi radar systems, among the most sophisticated Soviet equipment available, simply couldn't detect the F-117s approaching their targets. The first indication of F-117 presence was often weapons impact. The psychological effect was devastating. Air defense personnel knew coalition aircraft were operating in their coverage areas, but couldn't detect or engage them. AWACS coordination enabled coalition forces to operate with situational awareness Iraqi forces couldn't match. Coalition pilots knew where friendly and hostile aircraft were positioned. They received tactical directions from controllers managing the entire battle space. Iraqi pilots, once their ground control intercept network was disrupted in the opening hours, operated essentially blind, not knowing where coalition aircraft were until visual contact or missile launch. Training disparities created skill gaps as significant as technological advantages. American pilots averaged more than 300 flight hours annually in their primary aircraft. Regular participation in sophisticated training exercises like Red Flag exposed them to realistic threat simulations. Instrument flying, night operations, and complex mission profiles were routine rather than exceptional. Iraqi pilots averaged approximately 100 hours annually, and that average had declined following the Iran-Iraq War's conclusion in 1988, as budget constraints limited flight operations. The skill gap was insurmountable through courage or motivation alone. Coalition pilots were simply more proficient in every aspect of air combat and strike operations. The sortie rate capability difference was equally dramatic. Coalition forces could surge more than 3,000 sorties daily when required, and sustain more than 2,000 sorties daily for extended periods. Iraqi capability, even assuming all aircraft were operational and airfields functional, maxed out at perhaps 200 to 300 sorties daily. The disparity meant coalition aircraft were operating continuously, while Iraqi forces could mount only limited operations that were quickly overwhelmed. When Operation Desert Storm commenced on January 17, 1991, Iraqi forces faced an air campaign that would prove unlike anything seen in modern warfare. The execution would demonstrate how overwhelming superiority in numbers, technology, and training could render an opponent's forces ineffective in days rather than weeks. The air campaign divided into distinct phases, each with specific objectives that built toward comprehensive dominance and the conditions necessary for successful ground operations. Phase 1, the Strategic Air Campaign, began at 02:38 hours on January 17th and continued through the first week of operations. The objectives were to decapitate Iraqi command and control, suppress air defenses, establish air supremacy, and begin degrading strategic targets essential to Iraq's military capability. The initial strikes centered on Baghdad and other command centers throughout Iraq. F-117 Nighthawks conducted the opening attacks, their stealth characteristics enabling penetration to downtown Baghdad without triggering air defenses until weapons impacted targets. Communications facilities, government ministries, housing military command functions, and command centers coordinating Iraqi military operations received precision strikes that severed leadership from military forces within hours. Simultaneously, HARM anti-radiation missiles engaged Iraqi radar sites throughout the country. Wild Weasel missions, conducted primarily by F-4G Phantoms, but also F-16s, equipped with HARM capability, systematically engaged any Iraqi radar that activated. The doctrine was simple. If an Iraqi radar operator turned on his system, a HARM missile would engage it within minutes. By the end of the first 24 hours, Iraqi air defense operators faced an impossible choice: activate radar and provide coverage, but risk immediate engagement. Keep radar offline and survive, but provide no coverage. Most chose survival. F-15C Eagles established combat air patrols throughout Iraqi airspace, positioned to intercept any Iraqi fighters that attempted to challenge coalition operations. The F-15's superiority was absolute. Iraqi fighters that attempted to engage were detected by AWACS well before they reached coalition strike packages. F-15s received vector commands positioning them for beyond visual range missile shots. The engagements were one-sided. Iraqi aircraft detected too late. Coalition missiles guided to impact. Iraqi pilots had perhaps seconds between missile launch and impact, insufficient time to react effectively. B-52 Stratofortresses conducted arc-light missions, carpet coverage of Republican Guard positions with conventional ordnance. Each B-52 delivered dozens of 500-pound bombs across an area measured in hundreds of meters, creating saturation coverage that nothing survived undamaged. The psychological effect was as significant as the physical damage. Republican Guard units that had been considered Iraq's most capable forces found themselves under continuous bombardment from aircraft they never saw at altitudes they couldn't engage. Tomahawk cruise missiles, launched from warships positioned in the Persian Gulf and Red Sea, struck fixed targets throughout Iraq with precision that didn't risk piloted aircraft. The Tomahawks provided capability to engage heavily defended targets without exposing pilots to surface-to-air missiles or anti-aircraft fire. Iraqi Air Force response during the first week was limited and ineffective. Approximately 39 Iraqi aircraft attempted to intercept coalition forces during the first 7 days. 38 were engaged by coalition fighters and either eliminated or forced to retreat with damage. 1 escaped. The losses weren't distributed across Iraqi fighters encountering coalition superiority. They were concentrated in the brief period when Iraqi pilots still believed they could contest air superiority. After those first encounters, Iraqi pilot willingness to engage collapsed. The pilots who survived reported experiences that demoralized the entire Iraqi Air Force. They described being overwhelmed, facing 10 coalition aircraft for every Iraqi fighter, being engaged by missiles from beyond visual range before they could see their opponents, and operating without effective ground control because the command centers that should have directed them were either offline to avoid harm missiles or had been neutralized by strikes. Many Iraqi aircraft never took off. Some were disabled by strikes on airfields and hardened aircraft shelters. But many remained grounded because pilots refused to fly missions they considered suicide. Some aircraft fled to Iran, Iraqi pilots choosing internment in a former enemy's territory over continued combat against coalition forces. More than 100 Iraqi aircraft fled to Iran during the first 2 weeks of Desert Storm, removing themselves from combat without coalition forces needing to engage them. Air-to-air victory statistics demonstrated coalition superiority numerically. F-15C Eagles achieved 36 of the 39 Iraqi aircraft engaged during the first week, reinforcing the type's reputation as the world's premier air superiority fighter. F-A-18 Hornets, F-14 Tomcats, F-16 Fighting Falcons, and British Tornadoes achieved the remaining victories, all conducted at beyond visual range or from superior tactical positions that Iraqi aircraft couldn't counter. The CD campaign, suppression of enemy air defenses, consumed more than 2,000 harm missiles during the first week alone. The systematic engagement of Iraqi radar sites devastated the integrated air defense network. By day 3 of the campaign, surviving SA-2, SA-3, and SA-6 operators kept their radars offline continuously, survival taking priority over mission effectiveness. Coalition forces achieved air supremacy by the end of the first week, operating unopposed by Iraqi air defenses or fighter aircraft. Phase 2, battlefield preparation, commenced around day 8 and continued through day 35. With air supremacy established and strategic targets neutralized, the focus shifted to degrading Iraqi ground forces, particularly the Republican Guard units positioned in Kuwait and southern Iraq. A-10 Warthogs engaged Iraqi armor relentlessly. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon and AGM-65 Maverick missiles proving devastatingly effective against tanks, armored personnel carriers, and artillery. F-16s struck supply lines, interdicting the logistics network that sustained Iraqi forces. Artillery positions received continuous attention from coalition strike aircraft, systematically degrading Iraqi indirect fire capability. B-52s continued arc-light missions throughout the battlefield preparation phase. Republican Guard divisions that had entered Kuwait with full equipment strength found themselves reduced to 50% capability before ground operations commenced. Tank battalions that should have fielded 40 to 50 tanks reported fewer than 20 operational vehicles. Artillery batteries were degraded similarly. Infantry units suffered not just from casualties, but from the psychological stress of continuous bombardment against which they had no defense. F-111s conducted night precision strikes against hardened targets, the terrain following radar enabling low-level penetration in complete darkness, followed by precision weapons delivery on bunkers, command posts, and facilities that other aircraft couldn't effectively engage. The sortie tempo during Phase 2 averaged approximately 2,325 sorties daily, sustained for weeks. Coalition pilots flew multiple missions daily. Maintenance crews worked continuously to keep aircraft operational. The pace was exhausting, but sustainable, because of the logistics infrastructure established during Desert Shield. Iraqi capability collapsed to fewer than 200 sorties during the entire phase, most of those defensive combat air patrols that didn't engage coalition forces. Close air support preparations for the eventual ground offensive systematically degraded Iraqi defensive positions. Tank positions were mapped and engaged individually. Artillery sites received precision strikes. Supply depots were interdicted. Iraqi units along the border reported 30 to 50% equipment losses before the ground war commenced. Their combat capability significantly reduced before coalition ground forces even crossed the border. Phase 3, battlefield shaping, occurred during the final week before ground operations commenced on February 24th. The focus intensified on Iraqi forces directly opposing coalition ground units that would conduct the liberation of Kuwait. Forward positions received concentrated attention. Iraqi units holding defensive lines faced continuous strikes from A-10s, F-16s, and other coalition aircraft. Psychological operations accompanied the strikes with leaflets dropped warning Iraqi soldiers of impending attacks and encouraging surrender. The combination of physical destruction and psychological pressure degraded Iraqi will to resist. Battle damage assessment confirmed that Iraqi military forces had been reduced to approximately 50% combat capability before ground operations commenced. The air campaign had achieved its objective of creating conditions favorable for rapid ground success. When coalition ground forces crossed into Iraq and Kuwait on February 24, 1991, air power continued providing decisive support. A-10s engaged Iraqi armor attempting to maneuver against coalition advances. F-16s struck command posts and communications facilities. Coalition aircraft provided continuous presence over the battlefield, engaging targets as they appeared, interdicting Iraqi units attempting to reposition. The Highway of Death, the road from Kuwait City toward Basra, where Iraqi forces attempted to retreat as coalition ground advances made their positions untenable, illustrated air power's effectiveness in mobile warfare. Iraqi vehicles congested on the highway presented target-rich environments that coalition aircraft engaged relentlessly. The images of destroyed vehicles stretching for miles documented the futility of operating against coalition air power without effective air defense. Iraqi resistance collapsed within 100 hours of ground operations commencing. While ground forces deserve recognition for their execution, the air superiority that enabled them to maneuver without threat from Iraqi air or significant artillery, the degradation of Iraqi units before contact, and the continuous air support during operations all contributed decisively to the rapid victory. The Iraqi Air Force failure in Desert Storm resulted from multiple factors converging to create conditions where Iraqi pilots and units simply couldn't function effectively. Numerical inferiority was fundamental. 750 aircraft attempting to contest air superiority against 2,790 aircraft couldn't generate sufficient sorties to affect outcomes. Coalition forces maintained 24-hour-a-day air coverage. Multiple aircraft were available for every mission. Losses could be replaced from deep reserves. Iraqi forces lacked all these advantages. The technology gap manifested in every engagement. Beyond visual range missiles meant Iraqi aircraft died before they could employ their weapons. Stealth aircraft struck targets without Iraqi defenses detecting them until weapons impacted. Precision-guided munitions enabled coalition forces to hit specific aim points with single aircraft, while Iraqi forces required mass attacks with unguided ordnance to achieve similar effects. Training disparity showed in every aspect of operations. Coalition pilots executed complex missions flawlessly. Night operations, adverse weather operations, precision attacks, and air combat maneuvering all demonstrated proficiency Iraqi pilots couldn't match. The difference wasn't courage or determination. It was fundamental skill developed through thousands of hours of training. Doctrine inflexibility prevented adaptation. The centralized Soviet-style ground control intercept system Iraqi forces employed required intact communications and functional command centers. Coalition strikes disrupted both within hours. Iraqi pilots trained to follow ground directions couldn't adapt to independent operations. When controllers couldn't provide vectors, Iraqi pilots didn't know how to proceed. The doctrine that worked adequately against Iran proved useless against coalition forces. Logistics breakdown accelerated Iraqi collapse. Airfields struck continuously couldn't maintain operations. Repair capability was overwhelmed by the pace of damage. Fuel and ordnance supply was interdicted, grounding aircraft even when they survived strikes. Iraqi forces couldn't sustain operations under the intensity of coalition attacks. Leadership failure contributed significantly. Saddam Hussein micromanaged military operations, requiring tactical decisions to flow through him personally. The delays this created meant Iraqi forces couldn't respond to rapidly developing situations. Rigid hierarchy prevented initiative. Pilots awaited orders while coalition aircraft struck with impunity. Morale collapsed as Iraqi pilots realized the futility of continued resistance. Flying was suicide. Engaging coalition aircraft meant certain elimination. Many pilots refused missions. Others flew minimal profiles, avoiding contact with coalition forces. More than 100 aircraft fled to Iran rather than face coalition superiority. The psychological impact of overwhelming technological and numerical disadvantage was as significant as physical losses. Industrial inability to replace losses meant every Iraqi aircraft lost was permanent. No production lines existed to build replacement aircraft. No reserves of modern fighters waited at storage facilities. Every loss reduced capability permanently. Coalition forces replaced their 75 aircraft, lost during Desert Storm, from inventories containing thousands of aircraft. The sustainability difference was absolute. The legacy of Desert Storm's air campaign transformed military doctrine, technology development, and strategic thinking globally. The strategic implications were profound. Desert Storm demonstrated that massed air power, properly employed with technological advantages and sufficient numbers, could achieve strategic objectives that previously required ground forces to accomplish. The air campaign had degraded Iraqi military capability so thoroughly that the ground war became almost an afterthought, a necessary phase to physically occupy territory that air power had already rendered indefensible. The Iraqi military never recovered from Desert Storm. The Air Force remained degraded through the decade between Desert Storm and Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, never rebuilding to 1990 strength. The unwillingness to invest in modern aircraft, the impossibility of replacing experienced pilots lost during Desert Storm, and the continued pressure from sanctions and no-fly zones enforced by coalition air power prevented reconstitution. Modern military doctrine, particularly American doctrine, assumes air supremacy as the foundation for all other operations. Ground forces expect to operate without threat from enemy air. Naval forces assume friendly air power will protect them from air attack. The assumption sometimes generates overconfidence, but it reflects the reality that major operations without air supremacy face challenges Desert Storm demonstrated were nearly insurmountable. Technology proliferation following Desert Storm focused on precision-guided munitions becoming standard, rather than specialized weapons. The effectiveness of precision strikes influenced procurement priorities globally. Unguided ordnance, while still useful for certain missions, became secondary to precision systems that could achieve effects with fewer sorties and lower collateral damage. Coalition warfare models developed for Desert Storm, particularly the air tasking order process and multinational command structures, became templates for subsequent NATO operations. The Balkan interventions during the 1990s, Afghanistan operations after 2001, and Libya operations in 2011 all drew from organizational structures and procedures refined during Desert Storm. Adversary lessons focused on air defense, dispersal, and asymmetric approaches to counter overwhelming air power. Nations facing potential conflict with technologically advanced opponents invested in improved air defense systems, distributed their forces to complicate targeting, and developed tactics emphasizing survival rather than victory against air attack. The lessons Iraqi forces learned painfully influenced military thinking globally. The cost analysis reinforced the effectiveness of coalition operations. Coalition forces lost 75 aircraft total during 43 days of operations, representing approximately 2.7% of the force deployed. Iraqi forces lost more than 300 aircraft in combat, with another 150 fleeing to Iran. Iraqi losses represented approximately 60% of their pre-war strength eliminated, either physically or through defection. The sortie comparison was even more lopsided. Coalition forces flew more than 100,000 sorties during Desert Storm. Iraqi forces flew approximately 1,500 sorties, most of those defensive combat air patrols that didn't result in engagements. The ratio of 67-1 represented an unprecedented disparity in modern warfare, documenting the complete dominance coalition forces achieved. January 17, 1991, 02:38 hours. Iraqi air defense radars lit up as coalition aircraft penetrated Iraqi airspace in overwhelming numbers. Iraqi commanders, expecting an air war with the United States based on Vietnam-era assumptions, prepared to defend against perhaps 700 aircraft employing 1970s technology and tactics. What they faced instead was an international coalition deploying 2,790 aircraft, employing technology a generation ahead of Iraqi capabilities, coordinated through command and control systems that manage complexity. Iraqi forces couldn't comprehend executing an air campaign planned to exploit every Iraqi vulnerability systematically. Iraqi forces expected an air war with the United States. America brought an air war with the world, and Iraq never had a chance. Not because Iraqi pilots lacked courage, not because Iraqi commanders lacked experience, but because the gap in numbers, technology, training, and support was so enormous that no amount of courage or experience could overcome it. The lesson Desert Storm taught was clear. Air power, properly employed with sufficient numbers and technological advantage, could dominate warfare in ways that made traditional measures of military strength obsolete. Iraqi ground forces, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, were reduced to combat ineffectiveness by air campaigns that destroyed equipment, interdicted supplies, and demoralized personnel before ground contact occurred. The coalition assembled the largest air armada since World War II. They employed it with precision, coordination, and overwhelming force that defined modern warfare's character. And they demonstrated that when technological superiority, numerical advantage, and professionalism converge, the result isn't simply victory. It's dominance so complete that the enemy's options reduce to surrender or annihilation. Iraqi commanders prepared for war they understood. Coalition forces brought war that redefined what air power could accomplish. The shock Iraqi forces experienced in the opening hours of Desert Storm never diminished. It only grew as the campaign continued and the full scope of coalition capability revealed itself day after day, sortie after sortie, strike after strike, until Iraqi resistance collapsed under pressure they simply couldn't withstand. 75 years of aviation warfare history had led to this moment, and the moment demonstrated that air power's potential, long theorized but never fully proven, could achieve strategic victory through dominance so overwhelming that ground operations became almost secondary to air campaigns that broke an army before it could fight.